Welcome to the 25th episode of Called to the Bar International Law Over Drinks, a series of casual conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. In these conversations, we are speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer reviewed. I'm Dr. Juliette McIntyre, lecturer in law at the University of South Australia. And today I have stolen the microphone and intend to abuse the podcast for personal gain. As many of our regular listeners will know, I was awarded my PhD in March this year. So today I want to ask the panel, what do I do with myself now? We'll talk career planning, grant writing, and whether or not I should get another cat to fill the void left by my thesis. With me is the entire Call to the Bar team, minus one. We have Tamsin Philippa Paige, senior lecturer, but about to be associate professor, congratulations, at Deakin Law School. Douglas Guilfoyle, professor of international law and security at UNSW Canberra, and Ntina Tzouvala, associate professor at the ANU College of Law. And we're sending finger hearts to Imogen Saunders, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. Good afternoon, everyone. First question, what's your drink? Douglas.
Well, I'm once again, because it's 2:30 in the afternoon, into the Korean sampler tea box. I've gone back to the Meiwa flower tea, which I can't give Tamsin S tasting notes. It tastes nice, but I'm having it out of my new favorite piece of merch, an American, what would probably count as a small American coffee cup, branded with the West Point Military Academy logo.
Nice. Tamsin?
So I have a coffee which is from Patio Coffee, and it's the Annabelle blend, which sits somewhere between a blonde and medium roast with notes of roast almonds, malt, and stone fruit. It's pretty solid. I make it through my drip filter because I lived in America for too long and developed a taste for drip filter coffee over espresso. I'm a weirdo that way. I also have a sparkling water because it's warm and I've been sitting outside, and I'm having the coffee in my Team Tamsin mug that is merch from the Lost Girl TV show from like the late 2000s, which I just had to get. So there you go. If you don't know Lost Girl, go check it out. It is urban fantasy. The stupid is so much there that it burns frequently, and they have a Valkyrie named Tamsin.
We love it. Dina, what's your drink?
I forgot we were recording and I do not have a drink. And that tells our listeners a lot about the situation right now.
Sounds like you might need a drink.
Yes.
And because it is the afternoon, I am having my usual coffee beverage, which is a iced long black, iced Americano, depending on where you are based, that I made in the office kitchen. Unfortunately, not in my K-pop merch mug, which I ought to have bought when I was in Japan, but failed to do so. So, look, let's set the scene for this conversation a little bit, because we've already dedicated an episode to teaching international law. So this time around, we're going to focus a little bit more on the research side of things. And it has to be said that even though I only just finished my PhD quite recently, I am lucky enough to have a full-time job as a lecturer. And I acknowledge that many PhD students are in a much more vulnerable position than I am, relying on casual and exploitative teaching contracts or short-term research positions. But it's hoped that this conversation will resonate with and provide something useful for early career academics across all different circumstances. And so on that note, my first question for the panel is, will I ever stop being tired? Like, seriously, friends and I have talked about feeling completely burnt out at the end of our PhDs. Is that normal? And how long does it take to go away?
I think I'm the most recent PhD grad of the three of us on the panel, so I'm going to start here with my experience. And I didn't have the energy to start a new research project of any kind or any interest in anything for about 9 months after my PhD completion, noting that I had a 9 month period of examination limbo, shall we say, because of a disagreement over structure between my two examiners, and a decision by my university to, instead of sending it to a third examiner to sort that out, to decide to tell me to reconcile this irreconcilable disagreement. So that was that kind of broke me for a while on top of that. But it took me about 9 months to have the energy to start anything, to even have the interest of starting anything new. And that was when I was still tying up a couple of papers from the PhD that I never wanted to see again in my life. And honestly, it's been 6 years since my PhD was conferred, and I still don't want to engage with Security Council nonsense, but I keep having to. So, yeah, it's a whole thing. And I would say I got no research done for about 9 to 12 months after PhD completion, personally.
Dina?
So I went from the PhD to a postdoctoral position, so a sort of like research heavy position, but it was still in many respects very similar to what Tamsin said, in the sense that I didn't even open the file of the PhD, I would say, for 9 months after it was I had it examined. And I did obviously continue researching because like there wasn't much of a choice. I was in a research only position, but I would say I did very small things and things that were like a sort of like article length stuff that then I never picked up again, etc. So in a sense, I would say this sense of like, you can call it burnout, you can call it like visceral disgust towards if you were eating a meal for 4 years, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, when you were given the opportunity to stop eating that meal, usually most people would, you know. So it took me, I would say, 9 months to even open again the file. It took me over a year to write a book proposal. We will get to that. So I think most people, there's of course exceptions, need a period away from the PhD. And I would say, especially for people who already have jobs, I think it's worth um, taking as much freedom, whatever that sort of freedom is, but the freedom that the fact that you are not applying for jobs imminently, to put it on the side for as long as one needs.
Yeah, that's really reassuring actually, because it's been this really consistent conversation that everyone is just very, very tired. And I mean, I've made the mistake of being incredibly busy in the immediate aftermath of my PhD, but I thought, is this sense of intellectual exhaustion is the phrase that Tamsin's just offered. Is that standard? And it sounds like it is. But Dina, you mentioned books, and I think that might be a really good point to jump into the next question I had for you guys, because sorry, Doug, you don't get to talk about being tired. But the expected next step for PhDs seems to be you have to turn your thesis into a book. And I wanted to ask the panel, is this as necessary and urgent as everyone seems to think? And I'd love to know what the process was like for you. Doug, I'll start with you since I skipped over you last time.
Well, I'm probably a bad example in the sense that I know Dina, for example, reworked her thesis extensively before it became the book. My supervisor was very much of the school of you need to turn the PhD into a book as much as possible. You should write the PhD as a book. You should try and get the book contract as early as possible. And so really the only thing I did after submission for probably, a good 18 months was finish the process of turning the PhD into a book and write one 10-page current development note. Now, is it urgent and is it necessary? I'd say it's not. Urgency, I think, depends on a number of things. So let me start from this proposition. I think a book is generally a good thing for your career and for your visibility to your field. So something I think I've said once or twice, even to people on this call, is that we're, in a sense, read for our articles, but we're remembered for our books, right? So, why does Tamsin keep getting roped into Security Council madness? Because that's the book, right? Why do I'm no longer looking at that much at maritime security. Why do I still get asked to write on maritime security? It's because of the book. So it's very useful in establishing your reputation. Is it necessary? No. You can break a PhD up into a collection of papers, and if you publish them prominently, maybe you get the same sort of effect. So there are other ways of doing it. I do think, though, it's the fastest, directest, most reliable way of making an early reputation. And is it urgent? Urgency, again, my advice here is just very mercenary. It depends on what the competition is like, right? If there are a lot of people writing in your field now, then being one of the early books is A, better, and B, saves you a lot of revisions.
Yeah.
Because if other people's books come out before yours, you're going to have to take them into account. So there's a big first mover advantage, both reputationally and in having less work to do, right?
Yeah.
So one of my first PhD students, actually, I became his second supervisor towards the end of his PhD. We had this really frightening first meeting where I didn't know how to supervise and he didn't know me. And we realized that his project was essentially the one I'd just finished, right? But we had very different approaches to a number of theoretical questions, and we defined the scope of the problem differently. So within about 30 minutes, we realized we could be professional friends and this wasn't going to be a huge problem. But nonetheless, he had to take my book into account when he finished his.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Tamsin, what was the experience like for you?
Okay, so I'm in Australia, I'm a bit of an anomaly in that I never did honors. I came to my doctorate through an MPhil, so Masters by Pure Research, and then my PhD. And I got some amazing advice from my MPhil supervisors, which was Rob McLaughlin and Don Rothwell. And they said, get 2 or 3 articles out of your MPhil. So when it comes to your PhD, you can write the book and write it as a book and deal with the examination problems that creates. So I literally sent my PhD manuscript to the series editors where my book was published and they said change thesis to book and we'll publish this as is. I had the easiest experience ever, but that's what caused all the examination problems I referred to previously was that issue there. So it's not without problems, but the reason I was given that and the reason I was given that advice, and this is, I think, a really good one, the further you get from your PhD, the harder it is to find time to write a book. And I'm experiencing that now in the fact that I am years overdue on another monograph that I just need to finish writing a couple more chapters and I can submit it, but I can't find the time and headspace between all of my other commitments in running a JD degree, between teaching, between mentoring people, between running an interest group for Ansel, between editing 2 books that just came out, where I didn't contribute a chapter, but I edited both of them, and all of those things. And so if you do the book early, it's easier than the longer you leave it, the harder it is to get a book out. And again, going back to the advice I was given from Rob McLaughlin, and I don't know how much this holds, but his advice during my MPhil was if you want to make associate professor without a major grant, you need a book. And he said, and the earlier you get that done, the easier it is. And as someone who literally just got promoted to associate professor without a major grant beyond the Endeavour Fellowship I got during my PhD, I think the advice pans out. But again, I approached my PhD as a book and I had examination problems in the PhD because of that, mostly because one of the examiners didn't like the fact that I didn't follow a thesis structure. But it made the publication of the book really easy, contra to Dina's experience, and I'll throw over to her now.
Yeah, I took ages, but I don't recommend that to anyone. Do as I say, not as I did. So, look, is it urgent? No, on account of literally nothing in academia being urgent. Like, just this is not a line of work where things are urgent. Like, people who do cardiovascular surgeries have urgent stuff. That being said, as Tamsin and Doug implied, it can be a very good way to achieve certain professional goals related to promotion, related to grants, related to a number of things. And I also do think it is a very valuable exercise, right? Whether maybe someone has done it more or less during the PhD, but I do think that the skills and intellectual contribution, and intellectual sort of like power that you need to stay with the argument in a book format for 80 or 100,000 words is not equivalent to 4 articles of 20,000 words, right? Or 6 articles. I do think, and in a sense, I do think it is used very often for promotions in law, and I think rightly so, because I do think it exhibits a mastery, both of the topic, but a mastery of genre that is different from article writing. Right. And again, I agree with Tamsin that depending on how was your PhD, this might require more or less work. I did a lot of work. I essentially rewrote it from scratch. It bears a passing resemblance to the PhD, because my PhD was trash. Hopefully that was only my problem. But I think what is generalizable here is this. I don't think it's possible to do a 30% revision from the thesis to the book, which is what I tried to do. I think you either do, I fix the typos, I include some more cases, maybe that came out between, like I do an updating, I fix the typos, I fix some linguistic things, and it's out. Or if you start moving things around, you will, in my experience and in my observation, end up rewriting it from 80 to 100%. So I think there is minor revisions and there is full rewrite. The middle way will be weird, and also I think it will just read weird because you're a different person. Like I ended up with some new chapters, and once that happened, it was clear that the old chapters had to be rewritten because it looked like they were written by 2 different people, and in many respects they were. I wrote 2 different people. So different people will make different evaluations on whether they are I want to rewrite it or I want to get it out immediately, based on their career moment, based on whether they think that sometimes you have this like road to Damascus moments, right? When you're like, oh no, now I have seen something. I have understood something about the world or about law, and I just cannot go back. And like I had this moment during my examination. There was a moment in which I said something and I was like, oh no. And once that happened, I just couldn't put the book out with my name on it, including for the reason that Doug said, which is there is articles that I have written and they're out there that I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't love them, but they're fine. But as Doug said, I do think the book is remembered, but also I do think it makes a sort of intellectual statement that it is better rather than worse to feel fully behind it. At least for the first 10 minutes, because on minute 11 you will hate it. But yeah.
Well, can I just, this isn't in the script, but can I just ask a follow-up question then? I mean, in terms of the process, did you get a book contract based on your thesis, or did you rewrite the manuscript and then get a book contract? How did that work? Dina and then Doug.
Okay, I have very strong opinions about that. Unless the publisher asks you explicitly and unequivocally to send the whole manuscript, don't send them the whole manuscript. Send them the 2 best chapters, which is what I did. I got away with it. And I also see this a little bit as a peer reviewer of manuscripts. sometimes they're so thisy in a way that I'm like, oh, I can kind of see how this would be a lovely book, but if you had sent me the two best chapters, I would feel so much more cheaper
Mm.
about this. Sometimes you cannot avoid it. Sometimes the publisher will demand. What I did is I didn't rewrite it. I sent the two best chapters. And I said in the proposal how I was going to rewrite it, which, by the way, turned out to be not how I rewrote it. Because also the other thing that people need to know is that unless you're going for a US university press, for better or for worse, once you get the contract, you have a lot of freedom on what to do, right? I think unless you deliver a manuscript on a different topic, it's not going to be a problem. So I sent the two best chapters, as well as a very detailed explanation of how and what I was going to change, which also though turned out to be untrue.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because that's what I'm wondering about. So I've sort of said things and now I'm like, I'm not sure I'm gonna be able to follow through with them necessarily. Doug, what was your experience of that process like?
Oh, so I'll come back to my experience, but first to kind of make a high level point. First thing to do about, what do I need to do to get a book publishing contract? You need to comply with whatever the publisher website says they need for a book proposal. So this is my equivalent of Tamsin going, read the charter. Swear words omitted. But so what publishers want will vary a bit, particularly from a post-PhD project, but typically it's a sort of annotated outline or table of contents. These are the chapters and what they'll address. Usually 2 sample chapters, some kind of cover letter explaining how you will change it from a PhD to a book. And sometimes publishers will want to see, though I wouldn't surrender them unless I was asked, examiners' reports, because that will also give them confidence in the quality of the work. Now, how I went about getting a publishing contract was, this is the most ludicrously overprivileged thing, but I'll tell it because it's kind of amusing. I was at a Lauterpact Centre lunchtime talk and was stood over sandwiches next to the commissioning editor at Cambridge University Press for International Law, who asked, so what's your PhD on? I got it out in a sentence, the law of stopping and searching ships on the high seas. And she said, yes, I'd agree there's a book in that, send me a proposal. Now, it still had to go through the ordinary process,
Yeah.
right?
I can see, I can picture that image in my head. I got to tell you, I can visualize that. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and particularly when it was Finola O'Sullivan, who had that kind of like, yes, fine. But yeah, I don't believe she's there any longer. Anyway.
Yeah. No, okay. Well, that's really genuinely useful advice, actually. Thank you. But moving then on to, I mean, let's say I get my book proposal out, but I have other things I need to do. So what about journal articles, which is the next big ticket item? The expectations in terms of output seem to be pretty different depending on where you work. So, I mean, on average, what's a good number of articles to write in a year, or does it matter where they get published or only that they get published? Tamsin?
Okay, so I think out of the 3 of us that you're speaking with, my university has the most restrictive publication policy for academics, which is why I'm chiming in first. And so my advice here is know your workload publication policy and know what your expectations of publications are for promotion. Um, because it's a fucking game. It's a game. And if you treat it as anything other than a game, it'll drive you to despair and madness. But Deakin has I think 2 um, international law journals that are considered A star, which is top of the tree for Australia, and about 10 more that are considered like A. And anything outside of A and A star doesn't get counted as a quality publication as far as Deakin's concerned. Um, and I have one law and humanities journal, which is where most of my work lives these days, if that's considered an A. So I do a lot of co-authoring for stuff that's doctrinal that'll go into an A star or an A international law journal. mostly because they look at what I'm doing and go, that's not law, it's sociology. Why would we publish that? And I have struggles there. So I do a lot of co-authoring to satisfy the institutional requirements. And then this is why I prefer writing books to articles because I like making a long form argument, but also it's easier for me to play the publication game with books than it is with articles. And so therefore I can then do whatever I want for everything else after I've satisfied their requirements. At B level, where you are now as a lecturer, at Deakin, you'd need to publish two A or A star journal articles every 3 years on a rolling 3 year. I'm at about four now. Well, I will be at like 4 to 4.5 every 3 years, with books counting as two articles and book chapters counting as half an article. Um, over a 3 year average period. So articles matter, but it's better to publish one good article according to whatever your metrics are than three ones that are shit. Um, but that's also just for like sense of self-respect as well. That's the case. I'd rather publish stuff that's good and I'm happy to have my name on than go, yeah, that was a bit of shit, wasn't it? And kind of pretend I didn't publish it. So thankfully, I only have one piece that I kind of look back on and go, yeah, I don't really agree with anything I said in that now. And that was published a long time ago. But yeah, quality matters over quantity, but quantity still matters.
Yeah. Doug?
Yeah, so I'd agree with all of that. And what Tamsin's done is give the listeners kind of an under the hood look at the sort of metricization of performance at universities. And, it starts from an in principle sort of justifiable instinct, right? That, if 40% of our contract is research and publication, then essentially it's kind of a fraud on your employer to never publish. So surely there should be some kind of system that makes all of this a little bit more objective. But it rapidly turns into, as Tamsin has said, a game, right? Because no system that's reduced to rules and rankings can ever adequately capture what's going on. So I'm presently at an interdisciplinary school, not a law faculty. And in terms of the research output metrics generated by my school, what I think is probably, the best single article I've ever written appears in what they regard, and which was in the British Yearbook of International Law, which I think we would all regard as a pretty serious journal, is unranked for the purposes of local internal metrics. Happily, I've reached my terminal promotion, so that doesn't matter. And in a promotion application, I could explain nonetheless why it was important, but you do need to keep at sort of earlier career stages an eye to what the local rules are. And as Tamsin says, if you argue the toss every time about, but this doesn't capture what's genuinely meritorious, I mean, that's a struggle you can have or can't, but you just kind of have to accept, if I'm playing the game of career progression and promotion, the rules have been given to me in advance, and I can choose to comply with them or not. But as someone said to me when I did community radio as an undergraduate, you are not bigger than the format, right? Like, this is the slot you've been given. You're not an artist. You are here to kind of get on with the job. All right.
Yep.
In terms of how many a year, for all that Tamsin just said that, Deakin expects, what was it, sort of 2 over 3 years? That
2 over 3 years at B, and it's up to about 4 and a bit over 3 years at E.
Right.
At D, sorry.
I mean, that strikes me as actually kind of relaxed in terms of quantitative outputs compared to some other universities, and fairly reasonable. Over the course of the year, what I've published in terms of journal articles as opposed to book chapters in any given year has varied wildly. It has ranged from 0 to 6. And 6 is not because I was pumping out a peer-reviewed journal article every 2 months, right? It was because things got stuck in pipelines with co-authors where sometimes the blocker was me, or things got stuck in editorial processes, or it was accepted by a good journal, but they had a long queue for publication. So sometimes things just cluster.
Yeah.
Personally, at my level, and given the way I work, I usually aim for about 2 journal articles a year as a kind of a rough internal expectation. But sometimes, one or both of those may be co-authored, which is again a different experience. On where they get published, independently of what your local organization or institution regards as good journals, I would say you should aim to place uh, every article as well as you can in terms of both. And really, the point is, how do I reach the audience I want?
Mm.
Right? So if you want to be known within a particular narrow subspecialism, like if I was aiming to reach serious law of the sea scholars in the first instance, I would think of journals like Ocean Development and International Law, if that was my target audience. But I generally try with my articles to reach a generalist audience as much as I can. And I know the journals that suit my style. So the journals I've published with most frequently are probably International and Comparative Law Quarterly and the Melbourne Journal of International Law, both of which are usually regarded as, by any rational organization, very good journals, right? But the point of both of those journals is they reach a generalist audience first. And that is my personal aim, that I want to be read by generalists first and specialists in my subdiscipline second. Anyway, I've probably been ranting for far too long, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, but there's a lot of strategy behind these decisions actually. So that's really insightful. Dina, did you have some advice for me on this topic?
Okay, so like just a couple of things so I think like the numbers that have been flying, I think they sound about right to me, but yeah, I agree. Like read the policy and also like talk to whoever one's manager is, associate in research, direct manager. And I think that can also be a very helpful way of like understanding how these policies work in real life, like law in the books versus law in context sort of situation. And I think that can be very helpful. Um, I think like I have very contradictory feelings about quantification. In my contradictory feeling, and in general about sort of like the formalization of performance in universities. I think it's trash for many reasons. I don't think I would be having a job if that change hadn't happened.
Hmm.
By which I mean, I think that actually, if you are relatively heterodox within your field, it is easier to actually nevertheless say, guys, look, it doesn't matter if you think that what I do is or is not law. Because like Cambridge University Press and Leiden Journal of International Law think that it is. So
Mhm.
let's instead of solve it on the merits, because we will not agree, let's solve it on the form.
Yeah.
So I think I weirdly have benefited partially from what I think is actually a bad system. And
Mm.
that's how you know you start making it in life. When you're like, this policy is objectively bad, but it actually benefits me. Stage 2 tax cuts. And uh, so that is one thing. The other thing I think that sometimes more junior people see when it comes to more senior people, and it can be a bit stressful and it shouldn't be, is I think at some point it becomes easier to publish articles or chapters because one gets invited to do so.
Hmm.
So I would say, especially more junior people, not to look and freak out seeing what more senior people are doing because they're very often not doing the thing that you're doing. you're not going through double blind, or you're going through double blind, but in a very particular situation in which a symposium has already been accepted by a journal, and like they send it, and the symposium editors decide who is the double blind. So in a sense, I'm trying to say it is good, and most universities do tailor expectations based on performance, but I also think because in academia we are also a little bit our own managers, it is important for people in earlier stages not to overwork themselves when it comes to articles and chapters based on the performance, and also what of more senior academics, because they might be getting invitations that you're not yet, or because they have a longer pipeline, right? There are things that I always have a folder with articles that I have been writing now for 7 years. And at some point it will finish. And on that year, it will look like I wrote 2 articles, but I didn't.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense.
So on book chapters, and I think Tamsin's got a point to make this about this as well, I would say they are now generally less well regarded as publications than certainly books, but also peer-reviewed journal articles. And it can be, as a junior scholar, very hard to say no to an invitation to contribute to a book because you feel recognized, it's potentially prestigious. So again, I think you have to be a bit strategic about book chapters, both in terms of what you can take on and when it makes sense to say yes. So it might make sense to say yes, for example, if it's basically retreading a part of your PhD and not going to be a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
It might make sense if it's going to be, say, a big research handbook that's directly on your field and you want to appear in the table of contents.
Yep.
But the other thing you can do sometimes, again, being strategic, is thinking, okay, I've been invited to contribute to this handbook. They may well have sent me the table of contents. Is there something it would be better for me to be writing than what I've been invited to do? So, for example, I and Tamsin are both very heavily known for piracy. When I got an invitation to contribute a chapter to the Oxford Handbook on the International Law of the Sea, it was inevitably on piracy. I noticed they had a gap for the high seas regime. And I was, again, in terms of projecting myself more as a generalist and not being pigeonholed, I said, could I do that instead of what you've asked me? And they said yes. So anyway, that's just a few thoughts about chapters, and I think Tamsin has some as well.
Yeah, so my first point is don't overwrite your articles. You can always do more work on a piece, and reviewers are always going to find something to comment on. So send them something where you've hit a point that it's 90, 80, 90% done. But you know it needs something done to finish it for publication. Send it to the reviewer. Let the reviewer tell you what you need to do rather than I try to get it perfect before you send it for review. It will save you a lot of time and stress. Give reviewers something to comment on so they're not looking for comments to make. It will save
Absolutely.
it will
Absolutely.
save you so much time and effort. And remember, good enough is fucking perfect. Is this good enough for publication? If yes, get it the fuck off your desk. Get it out of there. Stop thinking about it. Move the fuck on with your life and stop working on it. Stop sending your time and energy on shit that is fine.
That is actually genius and probably one of the best bits of career advice I've had so much good advice already in this pod, but that's like blown my mind actually, the idea that you could use the reviewer process to solve that little niggling problem that's making your paper really not quite perfect, but it's kind of mostly good enough. I'm that little brain
Can I come in
explosion
on,
emoji.
yeah, can I come in
Yeah.
on that? Because I fundamentally agree with Tamsin, but the metaphor I always use is the great English painter J.W.M. Turner would never finish his paintings for exhibition because when you went to the Royal Academy exhibition, they filled the whole wall, right? Floor to ceiling, and your painting just got jammed in where there was space. And he wanted his stuff to pop. So he would go in on what was called varnishing day, where you were meant to just do mild touch-ups and put a protective layer of varnish over your painting. And he would 80% finish it, like Tamsin said, then go in and see what everyone else was doing around him. And at that point, just do the finishing touches. And it really pissed off other artists at the period. But again, I take that sort of attitude towards submitting something. Is it mostly there? Yeah, sure. Why not? Like, you're going to have to do this extra 10 or 15% after you get peer review feedback. Why not put it in when you think it's 85 to 90% there? Also, if you work on it till you are 100% happy with it and you've polished it to perfection, how are you going to be able to take on peer reviewers' comments, right? Like, you're not going to have the space left to do that. Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's more emotionally devastating too, because you think you've put something together that is perfect, and then someone comes through and critiques it, and that makes you feel terrible. And so this is amazing. This has revolutionized my writing practice already. And so look, I've got one more really big ticket item, which is such a strange one for me, but it's grant writing, okay? Because I've got these sort of vague plans in the back of my mind about applying for what's called a DECRA. For those not in Australia, it's a Discovery Early Career Researcher Award. It's basically a big federal government grant, big pot of money. And I think the success rate for applications overall is something like 15 to 20% and way lower for law. Yet the vibe that we seem to get as early career academics is that in order to progress in your career, you've got to get some external funding. And look, frankly, I can't even make up things in my head that I would use external funding for. I don't know what I need money for, other than I just need time. I need time and a library. So I'd love to hear your views on grants. Are they actually just a distraction, or are they useful?
I'm going to start here because I have some strong feelings, mostly because I have rejected the whole apply for grants process entirely, mostly because I looked at it and went, in the time it takes me to do a DECRA application, I could write 3 articles, and none of because I started my work either sits in empirical sociology or conceptual sociology of law, and I'm doing a lot of conceptual stuff at the moment that doesn't need funding for field work.
Hmm.
And so I look at it and go, what would I use this grant for? It would buy out my teaching. I've actually got my teaching set really well. And if it gets bought out, I lose the subjects that I like teaching and I can teach on that run on Rails. And then when a grant finishes, I have to go and learn a whole bunch of new subjects and fit back into a teaching ecosystem. And that's going to be worse for me long term professionally. So I can't be bothered. And so I think that everyone looks at, and I've watched a lot of colleagues go, I need to get this grant, and they get this grant, and then they're like, oh crap, I've got to do the work I said I'd do in the grant. But I've also just applied for another grant that I've got that's a different project, and I can't do all the work, and I don't really want to do the work, and how do I deal with this? And I'm just like, just don't apply for the grant if you don't want to do the work. So my approach is. Look, yes, it probably makes promotion easier when it comes down the line, but you can deal with those hurdles by doing other things to get you over the line. Happy to discuss that offline with you later around that because we don't have time now. But if you don't need the money from the grant, either to buy out your teaching or to do field work or whatever, don't spend the time that you could be doing actual research applying for money to do research.
Yeah. And Doug, as the recipient of a rather large federal government grant, I feel like you might have some useful things to say on this subject.
Yeah, sure. And look, Tamsin's outlined the perfectly rational case for not applying for grants. And there have also been, I think, macro estimates that the amount of person hours spent in Australia applying for federal government grants is more in terms of value than the amount the federal government hands out.
Oof.
So actually, the grant system has a net negative impact on research. The other thing I should say is that anyone listening in the American academic ecosystem will probably be like, grants? What are you talking about? But in sort of the English-speaking Commonwealth, applying for central grants is a fairly big thing. Tamsin is right. Grants definitely smooth your way to promotion. I think it's increasingly difficult to get to E without a grant. It's not impossible, but then you're probably looking at doing something like, really excelling in a major administrative portfolio or some other thing. All right. Now, and again, as Tams has put it, some grants are not worth having if you've only got them for the purpose of getting a grant on your CV, because you might come up with a very fundable project, but it's not actually the one you want to do. So there are a number of different things to consider. But from where I am with one of the really nice grants that has brought me out of teaching for 4 years, so I can do the kind of research that most people would think from looking at, say, television dramas that, professors actually do. It's been a very rare window in my life. Working backwards, you can only get to this grant having done other grants, right? Because the first thing a grant giving body will look at is what grants have you had before. So you actually have to kind of get runs on the board and show a certain level of project management skills if you want to get to the good ones. But in terms of smaller grants, what might one spend money on? Well, one of my first grants was for an edited book that was quite well received on the law of piracy. And I used the money to bring, internationals to London to do a workshop. That was the principal cost. So there are things you can find to spend the money on. Also, because law doesn't take a lot, sometimes that's actually quite good for the smaller grants, because you can put up a modest proposal that looks like, good value for money. In terms of what works with the larger grants, actually the easiest way to learn all of this stuff is really in a sort of journeyman apprentice model, right? Find a colleague who gets grants, get attached to one of their grants, and sort of learn the ropes from the inside. The thing I'd say about grant writing is it is a completely different genre from all other forms of academic writing. It is, as we were talking about before, something of a game. Unfortunately, unlike performance metrics within an institution, the rules are not known in advance. Like the rules disclosed in, particularly the Australian Research Council, the rules disclosed in the grant funding rules don't actually tell you how to write a grant in the genre that you have to submit. They're like a series of very high-level formal descriptors of, say, the contents of a detective novel from which you're meant to go away and write a detective novel, never having read a detective novel, right? Like that's not going to work, or it's going to be very hit and miss. The easiest way to understand how grants are written is to look at successful grant applications. But unfortunately, again, a lot of academics close hold this stuff because they fear that, if the knowledge gets out, somehow they'll never get a grant again because everyone will know how to do it, which is not normally how these things work. You normally pass through sort of career stage related grants, and actually sharing that information is, in a sense, only helping the people coming up behind you. So I guess those are my high level comments. I've probably missed some stuff, but I imagine we'll cover it in discussion.
Yeah, and Dina, have you received or applied for any grants?
I have applied, I have not received. But actually, so I think one should apply for a DECRA, not because one is going to get the DECRA or because you need the DECRA to progress, but because it is a character building exercise that is going to make anything else ever is going to happen to you in academia pale in comparison. Yep. I applied for some fellowships, unrelated fellowships, like overseas fellowships this year. And I was like, a page and a half? Joke. I have applied for a DECRA. Nothing can, I did it in 10 minutes. So look, a little bit less snacky. I don't think it's essential in order to progress up until a certain point. I appreciate what Douglas says about level E, but that might be more of a midterm issue. And I can think a lot of people in international law in Australia who did progress to it without it. It just perhaps took slightly longer, right? So I wouldn't apply for it for that reason. But I would apply for grants at some point in your life for a number of reasons. First, as Douglas says, it's a genre of writing, and you might discover it's a genre you're very good at, right? If you see in Australian legal academia, the range of people who have gotten big grants, I think what you see is not necessarily, I think where they cohere is not in their field or their methodological approach or anything. It's just people who can really do that, right? And you might be one of them. And I think that's really worth knowing, because I do think not having them is not a disaster, but having them can be very helpful.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Find out it can be in the form of the DECRA, but it can be in the form of a discovery project, which for those who don't know, it's smaller, collaborative, usually grants, right? Or it can be in the form of something else altogether. The second reason I think it is worth applying, what I was saying before in terms of like, I do think it is a character building exercise, which weird as it sounds, I think once you get it done, it will be hard to be faced by anything else,
Yeah.
both grant and non-grant related. And the third reason perhaps to apply that would be less universal and more like personal is if you are in a position where you kind of want to start a new project, but you can't quite kick yourself to do it, committing to applying can be enough accountability to like your research office and to whoever read the draft to actually, even if you don't get the grant, it can be for some people who, for whatever reason, either they're reluctant or you're not feeling it, it can be a way of kickstarting a new project within more structure than we usually get, right? Because the problem in academia is, well, the great thing in academia is that you don't have a boss that micromanages you daily. But the problem in academia is that you don't have a boss that micromanages you daily, right? And this can be just enough accountability to get you going. And I'm saying that as someone who applied twice for DECA, which is the maximum number of times you can apply. The first time I wasn't even close to getting it, and the second time I was on the top 10% of unsuccessful ones, and I have to say the second time was worse than
Oof.
it
You know,
hurt.
you know,
No,
you're not filling me with excitement here. I was thinking maybe I should move to Germany and write a habilitation instead. This is
just it's so, but again, I think if you're writing it not to necessarily get it,
yeah,
it could be a less grueling experience.
yeah,
But I don't think in most places, and again, that would depend on a conversation with one's associate dean for research and head of school. It is a reasonable expectation for someone to have one of these grants to be promoted to senior lecturer or to associate professor.
yeah.
I think, especially given the low rates of success, right? That would mean that 10% of people get promoted, and that's just not true.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, and so speaking of institutions and things, I've got one last question for the panel. If I was looking for a new place of employment, in case my boss is listening, I'm not actively doing that, don't worry. But you know, a lot of people at this career stage will be looking for places of permanent employment. So what were the things when you were looking for jobs at this career stage that mattered the most to you? Was it things like location? Was it the prestige of the institution? Was it the teaching load on offer? What was it that sealed the deal for you or was like a huge red flag? Tamsin?
Yeah, I'm I'm happy to start here and say that I've been at a number of institutions, both in Australia and for a while over in the US. And it turns out that I didn't care about the prestige of the institution. Deacon's a fantastic institution, but in the Australian ecosystem, we're considered a mid-range law school. Um, which, whatever, because actually my research is going to be the same no matter where I am. So fuck prestige. In the ear with a claw hammer. And like, I just don't care. What I actually cared about, because I was at prestigious institutions being I'm not going to mention them because I don't need to badmouth other institutions, but I was made to feel very unwelcome at prestigious institutions for being very visibly queer and very heavily tattooed, regardless of the quality of my work. And so for me, actually, what mattered was, am I welcome here? Am I going to
Mm,
be welcome in this institution to be myself and get on with my work and do my job well and be valued for me rather than for my markers of prestige or whatever that fits in. And for me, that mattered more than anything else. I would like to flag, though, that I'm fairly flexible in terms of location. I don't have family ties that kept me anywhere. I didn't have any of those requirements when looking for work. But yeah, it turns out that what mattered to me was not feeling like I was being barely tolerated by a bunch of bigots.
mm. Dina?
Yeah, so I apply, so I'm not Australian, and I wasn't, well, I'm technically a citizen, but I'm not really. Um, which means the good thing of that is that the psychic weight some institutions have in people's minds make less sense to me, right?
Yeah.
I don't, in the same way that the Oxbridge craze in the UK didn't have the same weight for me. So I am moving jobs in January, and my first and foremost consideration was location and family life. So I have been working at the ANU, but I've been living in Sydney, and I wanted to move fully in Sydney, right? So for me, location has been really important. What tends to go with prestige, and it matters to me, but not because of prestige, is resources. Um,
Mm,
it tends to be that the universities we think of as more prestigious tend to, and this is a correlation that is not perfect, but it's real, to have more available resources for research travel, right? So, for example, I think in some universities, if you want to travel overseas for conferencing, for example, either you have to get um the funding from the folks that are inviting you, or you have to have a grant, and it's difficult to get money from your own institution. For me, being able to have a reasonable amount of money, nothing crazy, but some money from my institution, especially for overseas travel, that is something I personally really value in terms of not just my career, but just like my intellectual development.
yeah.
That will tend to be in Australia, the places that we call the group of eight, but not perfectly and not at all times. And anyone who's reading the news currently will know that a number of group of eight universities are not going through a tough time, right? So that for me, life, like personal life, in combined with the reasonable amount of money, but nothing crazy, would be like pretty high on my list.
Yeah. Yeah. And Doug, you've moved a couple of times. What was your experience?
Look, I actually think, just separately from this whole question, being at more than one institution over the course of your career is a real plus,
Mm,
because people who've only worked at one institution become there's no diplomatic way to put this, a bit institutionalized,
Mm.
right? And you'll have, so a colleague tells stories of some of her senior colleagues still complaining that the tea trolley has been abolished at their institution. And she was like, what? And, 10, 20 years ago, there used to be a lady who'd come round with cups of tea and a slice of cake in the afternoon, which sounds delightful, but no modern university is going to support that kind of weird extravagance. But similarly, I've been at other institutions where people will complain endlessly about the most minor change to, for example, how you get your expenses reimbursed. I'm just like, honestly, if you had some perspective, having worked at a couple of different institutions, you would understand this is either no big deal, everyone's got it as bad, or actually this is better than most places.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think that's of value in itself. And really, I've often looked to move for family reasons. And at that point, in legal academia, there are often not that many jobs available. And to some extent, you have to take what you can get, right? If you're in the lucky position of already having a permanent post, meaning you're more competitive to apply for a permanent post. But ultimately, I guess what I've found is that there's this question of institutional fit, which is very hard to anticipate in advance. But when you find it, you should treasure it. So, Tamsin really values what she's got at Deakin in the way they've sort of been welcoming and prepared to structure her job in a way that suits her. I have only taught at law schools before arriving at UNSW Canberra, which largely teaches into the Australian Defence Force Academy. And that's been a very different environment, which I've just, really thrived in and would not have expected to enjoy it ahead of time. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many different factors to consider. But as you say, I think, for a lot of people, getting a permanent job is really the big ticket. And it's a luxury to be able to choose. But it's nice to know that, you don't have to feel pressured, I think, to only aim for these prestigious institutions or somehow feel embarrassed that your institution is not one of these high-ranking places or whatever it might be. So,
Can I say something to that, Jill?
yeah.
I think sometimes, and I have observed this both in Australia and in the UK, people are willing to put up with worse working conditions in order to be in a prestigious institution. And I'm talking about really material things like literally number of hours you're teaching. And when you're like, no, actually, in this other place that is not Oxbridge or is not the group of 8, they actually teach less. And you cannot make people believe that. Or like people would accept like lower salaries or being hired below what is their like market value in order to be in a prestigious place. And to me, that's just bonkers. Like it's one thing to make a determination that says, and again, as I said, I think it's a loose correlation that says, oh, this university tends to have more money. But to make it based on the prestige, or more so in my view, based on the idea that like only 2 places in Australia have a lively intellectual culture, that's both untrue, but I also think it's especially untrue in the era of like social media and Zoom, by which I mean you can have an intellectual community with people who don't work in the same department as you, and indeed they're not in the same hemisphere as you. It's not the same as having, lucking out and having amazing people in your department. But I do think that these days, for better or for worse, one can have a very vibrant intellectual life outside their institution if they choose to do so, right? And I think that has taken some of the pressures away about where you want to be, not only as of prestige, but like even if you land in a place in which not that many people do what you do, you can find your people online. Unfortunately, like much more terrible people found their people online. You know, a lot of like incels did the same, but also you can do it for your niche corner of international legal research.
Yeah. Well, look at us. We all found each other, even though we're all at completely different institutions. So, and look,
Absolute last point on that.
yeah.
The other thing is, once you've built your reputation, it doesn't matter where you are. You are
Mm,
still Douglas Guilfoyle, Juliette McIntyre, Tamsin Paige, Ntina Tzouvala, regardless of your institution. Now, if a prestigious institution gives you a bit more of a platform early in your career, maybe. But essentially, beyond a certain point, the currency we trade in as academics is reputation, and that reputation is portable and not dependent on your institution.
And can I also just say, people outside Australia don't generally know which are and which are not more prestigious. Like that's the other thing I think Australians think, because like all Americans think that all Australian institutions are irrelevant anyway. You know what I mean? Like I think sometimes Australians overestimate what is the prestige of these places outside of Australia.
yeah.
And I would say the gaps are smaller than most Australians assume.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not Yale or Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, yeah. But they're still great, and we have good beaches in most places. So except for Canberra, unfortunately. But look, we've got to probably wrap things up. Although this has been a really useful conversation, and I have learnt so many things. But look, we normally ask three questions at the end of every episode about escape routes and current projects. But this time, I'd like to ask everyone on the panel just one question. And on the basis that I now have more time and mental energy to read books, non-fiction books, can you please give me your recommendation? What is your favorite non-law book of all time? I don't want to learn anything on purpose from this book. I just want to know, what should I read for fun now that I'm done with my PhD?
Well, my views on this are idiosyncratic. I mean, I like my speculative fiction and fantasy. So the answer I came up to in response to this question was just, what are three books that I enjoy rereading and have reread more than once? And the three I came up with, all male authors, unfortunately, I'll have to do better later, is Michael Chabon's The Yiddish Policeman's Union, a sort of noir detective story set in an alternative Jewish homeland in Alaska. So speculative in the sense of that historical fact is different. China Miéville's The City and the City, another kind of police procedural, actually, in a universe that's only very slightly different from our own, where the conceit is that, and this does have a bit of a law bent, right? But where there are two legal jurisdictional cities that exist in the same actual space, which I always liked, and with a bit of an asterisk, unfortunately, for sexism, but it was fantasy very much of its time. Roger Zelazny's The Chronicles of Amber, which I just find a fabulous romp anytime I'm completely exhausted or sick in bed.
Excellent. Thank you. And for those who don't know, Doug actually wrote a journal article about The City and the City, which is terrific, and you should look it up if you haven't already encountered it. Dina?
Okay, I need to come out as a person who doesn't read much fiction. I used to, and at some point during the PhD, my brain broke. But that makes the recommendation even better because I read this book after my brain broke. Andrea Laura's Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl is the best. Like it changed my life. It does what it says in the can, which is a person who understands himself as male, man called Paul, who is also a shapeshifter. It takes place in the early 1990s, sort of like queer coastal city in America. And even for people who are not queer or any of that, if you have a body and if you have ever related to other humans, in a way that it's not necessarily sexual, but involved your body in any way. That book made me think of all of these things in such a different way. It's also beautifully written. It's a little smutty. It is fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you. And Tamsin.
I'm going to start by reminding everyone of Claire Coleman's comment that speculative fiction is science fiction for wankers, as a term. Um, so just had to go there. But anyone who has listened to the podcast will know that I adore the work of Seanan McGuire. I think she's a delightful human, and you should read any of her work. But my go-to is under her Mira Grant persona, which people associate with her writing sci-fi. She associates it with writing horror. Take your pick on which one version. And her Newsflesh trilogy, which is, well, it's actually 4 books because she added a book that runs parallel to book 1 from the perspective of characters who never appear in book 1. Um, and so you can either read the trilogy and then read feedback. So the trilogy is Feed, Deadline, and Blackout. And it's phenomenal. But then there's also feedback that runs parallel to Feed, and you can either read Feed and feedback, but reading feedback will give you spoilers for Deadline and Blackout. So it's up to you how you read them. But it is a political conspiracy thriller set 25 years after the zombie apocalypse. The zombies exist. They kind of exist as an allegory for terrorism and terrorists, which I've written an article about. But mostly it's a political conspiracy thriller set after the zombie apocalypse when the zombies are kind of just background noise. And it's fucking amazing. And everything that Ms. McGuire writes is amazing. And she's a phenomenal human. From my encounters with her, although she probably wouldn't remember it, but I have some of the best interview transcripts from interviewing her. And you should read her work, and I would start with the Newsflesh series.
Cool. All right. Well, they all sound very much up my alley, and I look forward to getting into those. Thank you all so much. That wraps it up for another episode of Call to the Bar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.